In 1941, hitting a bomber in the dark was statistical guesswork. By 1944, American pilots were shooting Ju-88s out of the sky on the first pass, all thanks to one British invention the Axis thought was impossible. The P-61 Black Widow was a terrifying night fighter, but it had a fatal flaw. Its guns were useless until a British scientist named Tizard helped deliver a spinning gyroscope that changed night warfare forever. Many remember the P-61, but few remember why it became so deadly. The Germans scoffed at Allied night fighters, but they weren't laughing when a small box of mirrors and gyros turned the Black Widow into the ultimate predator. In the long, dark history of human conflict, the Second World War holds a unique place. It was a war fought not just in the mud and the trenches, but in the laboratories, on the drafting tables, and in the unseen frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum. It was a war of physicists, engineers, and mathematicians, as much as it was a war of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. And nowhere was this technological battle more desperate, more urgent than in the night skies over Europe. When the sun set, a different kind of war began. It was a war of shadows and whispers, of straining eyes and phantom signals. For the men who flew into that black void, the enemy wasn't just the man in the other cockpit. The enemy was the darkness itself. In the early days, from 1939 through 1940, the very idea of a night fighter was almost a contradiction in terms. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, certainly seemed to think so. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, with his trademark arrogance, had famously boasted that if an Allied bomber ever reached the Ruhr, his name wasn't Hermann Göring. The Axis leadership, confident in their blitzkrieg and their seemingly invincible air fleets, scoffed at the idea that the British or the Americans could ever mount a credible threat after dark. Their own night operations, particularly the devastating blitz against London, had proven how difficult it was to stop a bomber stream. If they couldn't be stopped, how could anyone stop the Luftwaffe? They believed the night was their fortress. They believed the physics of the problem were simply too great to overcome. And for a time, they were absolutely right. Think about the sheer, mind-bending difficulty of the task. You are sitting in the cockpit of a fighter, vibrating, cold, breathing stale oxygen through a mask. Below you, the world is gone, hidden by a total blackout. Your only connection to reality is the dim glow of your instrument panel and the crackle in your headphones. Somewhere out there, miles away, is another aircraft. It's painted black, flying at 300 miles an hour, desperately trying to evade you. Your only hope of finding it is a primitive, flickering radar screen, a tiny green line painting a blip of energy. Your radar operator, sitting behind you in the dark, guides you in. Target, 3 miles, dead ahead, slightly above. You climb, your eyes straining, searching the blackness. The minutes stretch into an eternity. 1 mile, you still see nothing. Half mile, and then maybe a shadow against the stars, a flicker of exhaust. You've got him. But the hardest part has only just begun. Now you have to shoot him. You're in a 3-dimensional ocean, and both you and your target are moving, turning, climbing, diving. You can't just point your guns where he is. You have to point them where he will be in the half-second it takes for your bullets to travel from your plane to his. This is called deflection shooting, and it is the single hardest skill a fighter pilot had to learn. In daylight, a pilot could judge the target's range and angle by eye. He could see the wingspan, the shape of the fuselage. He could use his ring and bead gunsight, a simple circle projected on a piece of glass, to estimate the lead. He would fire a burst, see the tracers, and walk them onto the target. It was an art, a skill learned through hundreds of hours of practice. At night, all of that was gone. You couldn't see the target's wingspan. You couldn't judge the angle. Firing tracers was a betrayal. It gave away your position instantly, and the blinding flash would ruin your night vision for precious, fatal minutes. You had one chance, one short burst, fired in total darkness, based on a guess. The results were, to put it mildly, abysmal. In 1940, during the height of the Blitz, RAF night fighter pilots estimated they fired over 10,000 cannon shells and 50,000 machine gun rounds for every one German bomber they managed to shoot down. 10,000 rounds for one hit. The Axis wasn't just scoffing, they were proving their point. The night was safe. But they had underestimated the quiet, desperate ingenuity of their enemy. They had underestimated the boffins, the backroom scientists and engineers who were about to change the war. And they had certainly underestimated the legacy of a man named Henry Tizard. The story of how the Allies conquered the night, of how the P-61 Black Widow became the apex predator of the European skies, isn't a story about a bigger engine or a larger cannon. It's the story of a spinning top, a beam of light, and a piece of analog genius that allowed a pilot to see the future. This is the story of the Gyro Gunsight. Before we get to the solution, we must truly understand the depth of the problem. The Germans weren't just passively defending, they were actively weaponizing the darkness. Their Kammhuber was a masterpiece of integrated air defense, a grid of radar stations, searchlights, and flak batteries stretching from Denmark to the south of France. Each box in this grid was controlled by a ground-based radar system that would pick up an incoming RAF bomber. This ground controller would then guide a dedicated German night fighter, usually a Messerschmitt Bf-110 or a Junkers Ju-88, to an interception. The Ju-88 in particular was a fearsome opponent. It was fast, versatile, and rugged. Originally designed as a Schnell bomber, or fast bomber, it proved to be an incredibly adaptable airframe. The C and G models became premier night fighters, equipped with their own airborne radar, like the Fug 220 Liechtenstein. These crews were the Nachtjäger, the night hunters, and they were elite. They were racking up dozens, sometimes hundreds of kills. Men like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the ghost of St. Trond, would eventually claim 121 victories, almost all of them at night. They even developed a terrifying innovation called Schräg music, or jazz music. This was a set of 2 or more autocannons mounted in the Ju-88's fuselage, firing upwards at an angle. The German pilot would be guided by his ground controller until he was underneath the RAF bomber, in its massive blind spot. He would ease his plane up, matching the bomber's speed, until the Lancaster or Halifax filled his gun sight. A single devastating burst of cannon fire would rip through the bomber's fuel-laden wings. The bomber would disintegrate, often without its crew ever knowing they were under attack. This was the brutal reality the Allies faced. Their bomber streams were being bled white. The Americans, preparing to launch their own daylight bombing campaign, knew they would also need to fly at night. They needed a dedicated night fighter, a machine built from the ground up to stalk and kill these German predators. The call went out, and the American aviation industry, the arsenal of democracy, responded. The proposal from John K. Northrop was the most radical. It wasn't a modified bomber or a repainted day fighter. It was a monster conceived in darkness. It was the XP-61, the Black Widow. The P-61 was a revolution. It was the first aircraft in history designed specifically as a night fighter. Everything about it was optimized for the mission. It was huge for a fighter, with a 66-foot wingspan powered by 2 massive Pratt & Whitney double Wasps. It needed that power because it was packed to the gills with the latest, most secret technology.
In its nose, it carried the SCR-720, the pinnacle of American airborne radar. This set, derived from the British AI Mark VIII, was a true marvel. It could scan the sky ahead, and the radar operator, or RO, sat in the rear of the cockpit, interpreting the green sweeps on his scope. But the genius of the P-61's design was the crew integration. The pilot flew the plane, the RO found the target, and, in many models, a third crewman, a gunner, sat in a separate compartment to manage the dorsal turret. And the firepower. It was simply overwhelming. 4 20mm cannons were mounted in the belly, clustered tightly together. This meant their fire converged on a single point, with no need for the harmonization that wing-mounted guns required. It was a buzzsaw. On top, many models featured a remote-controlled dorsal turret with 4 50-caliber machine guns. This turret could be aimed by the gunner or, significantly, locked forward and fired by the pilot. The P-61 was a masterpiece of American engineering. It was black, menacing, and bristling with guns. When the first production models rolled out in 1943, the crews of the USAAF's newly formed night fighter squadrons felt they had the war winner. But they soon discovered a terrible truth. They had a war-winning airframe, but they were still stuck with a 1918 gunsight. The P-61, for all its revolutionary radar, still came equipped with a standard reflector sight. It was the same old ring and bead, just with an electric light bulb. The pilot, having been guided by his RO to within a few hundred yards of a target, would then have to do the same impossible mental math as his British counterparts. He had to guess the range, guess the angle off, and guess the deflection. And, just like the British, the American pilots were missing. They were closing to point-blank range, 200 yards, 100 yards, and still their cannon shells were splashing harmlessly into the empty air behind the maneuvering U-88. The Germans, with their Schrager-Musik, were shooting from a stable, non-deflected position. The Allies were trying to solve a complex trigonometry problem in their heads, in the dark, in a fraction of a second. The Germans weren't just scoffing, they were winning. The P-61 was a sword without a swordsman. It was a powerhouse that couldn't land a punch. The frustration in the night fighter squadrons in England was palpable. They had the plane, they had the radar, they had the guts. They just couldn't hit anything. The solution would not come from an aircraft factory. It would come from a quiet campus of brick buildings in Farnborough, England, the Royal Aircraft Establishment, or RAE. And it would be delivered to the Americans through a channel of scientific cooperation that had been forced open by the vision of one man, Sir Henry Tizard. Tizard is one of the great unsung heroes of the Allied victory. He wasn't a general or a politician in the mold of Churchill. He was a scientist, an administrator, a quiet, brilliant man who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the coming war would be decided by technology. As chairman of the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, he was one of the driving forces behind the development of radar in the 1930s, the very technology that would save Britain during the Battle of Britain. But his most critical contribution came in the darkest hour of 1940. With Britain standing alone, its armies defeated on the continent, and invasion seeming imminent, Churchill made a decision of staggering importance. He agreed to send Britain's most precious, most secret technologies to the still neutral United States. The hope was that American industry could perfect them, mass-produce them, and perhaps, just perhaps, be drawn into the fight. The man chosen to lead this mission was Henry Tizard. In September 1940, Tizard and his team arrived in Washington, D.C. with a locked black box. Inside was the Tizard mission's crown jewel, a single revolutionary piece of technology called the cavity magnetron. This device, a small copper disc, was the key to high-power, high-frequency radar. It was the device that would make airborne radar small enough and powerful enough to truly be effective. It would eventually become the heart of the P-61's SCR-720.
The Tizard mission was a stunning success. It opened the floodgates of technical cooperation between the UK and the US. It established the principle that the boffins on both sides of the Atlantic were on the same team. And while the Gyro Gunsight itself was not in that first black box, the spirit of the Tizard mission is what made its later transfer and perfection possible. Tizard had built the bridge, and across that bridge, an idea was about to travel that would solve the impossible problem of deflection. We've covered a lot of the what and who, but to truly appreciate what happened next, we have to talk about the how. We're going to dive into the technology, but I want to make this clear because it's a history that many of us in the community value. We're fortunate to have records and diagrams that let us see just how this worked. We believe it's important to get this right. If you appreciate this level of detail, the kind of history that goes beyond the headlines, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to the channel. It's a simple click, but it sends a powerful message to us that you value this work, and it helps us ensure these stories continue to be told. We're grateful to have you here. Now, back to the problem. Back at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the scientists were attacking the deflection problem. They knew the pilot's brain was overloaded. He couldn't be a mathematician and a pilot at the same time. Therefore, the Gunsight itself had to do the math. What math? It's called trigonometry. The sight needed to know two things: the distance to the target and the rate at which the target was crossing the pilot's line of sight, the rate of change. The first part, distance, was tricky. In daylight, a pilot could estimate it. In the P-61, the radar could provide a range, but it wasn't perfectly instantaneous. The real breakthrough came when they realized they could let the pilot tell the sight the range. The pilot would adjust a dial, matching the target's wingspan to a known setting on the sight. In the P-61, this was even better. The radar operator could feed the range data directly to the sight. The second part was the true genius. How do you measure the rate of change? How do you measure how fast the target is moving across the sky and in what direction? The answer was a gyroscope. Most of us know a gyroscope as a toy, a spinning top that seems to defy gravity, but its scientific principle is profound. A spinning gyroscope has a property called rigidity in space. It wants to keep pointing in the same direction, no matter how you move the casing around it. If you try to force it to turn, it will resist in a very specific, predictable way. This resistance is called precession. The engineers at the RAE, building on work from firms like Ferranti, had a brilliant idea. What if they built a gunsight around a spinning gyroscope? Here is how the Mark II Gyro Gunsight worked. Inside the sight was a heavy gyro, spinning at tens of thousands of RPM. This gyro was mounted in a gimbal, a set of rings that allowed it to float freely. When the pilot was flying straight and level, the gyro just spun, pointing straight ahead. But the moment the pilot began to turn his P-61 to follow a target, say a J-88 banking to the right, the entire aircraft and the gunsight casing with it would move. The spinning gyro, because of its rigidity, would resist this turn. This resistance, this precession, would cause the gyro to tilt in a way that was exactly proportional to the rate of the turn. The engineers at the RAE, building on work from firms like Ferranti, had a brilliant idea. What if they built a gunsight around a spinning gyroscope? Here is how the Mark II Gyro Gunsight worked. Inside the sight was a heavy gyro, spinning at tens of thousands of RPM. This gyro was mounted in a gimbal, a set of rings that allowed it to float freely. When the pilot was flying straight and level, the gyro just spun, pointing straight ahead. But the moment the pilot began to turn his P-61 to follow a target, say a J-88 banking to the right,
The entire aircraft and the gunsight casing with it would move. The spinning gyro, because of its rigidity, would resist this turn. This resistance, this precession, would cause the gyro to tilt in a way that was exactly proportional to the rate of the turn.
The engineers harnessed this tilt. They attached a mirror to the gyro's gimbal. A beam of light from a lamp inside the sight would bounce off this mirror and be projected onto the pilot's glass screen. This created the pipper, the dot of light the pilot used to aim. Now, follow this because this is the magic. When the pilot is flying straight, the gyro is stable, and the pipper is in the center of the screen. When he banks to follow the WWII, his plane moves, but the gyro resists. This resistance tilts the mirror, and the mirror moves the pipper off-center. It moves it in the direction of the turn. How much does it move it? It moves it by the exact amount of lead the pilot needs. The faster the pilot turns to track the target, the more the gyro precesses, the more the mirror tilts, and the further the pipper moves, automatically calculating the perfect deflection. The pilot no longer had to think. His only job was to keep the magical moving pipper on the target. The sight did the rest. It was, quite literally, an analog computer. It took the pilot's own turn rate as the primary input, combined it with the range, which the pilot or RO fed in, and solved the trigonometry problem instantly, displaying the answer as a single moving dot of light. This was the weapon the Allies had been waiting for. It was the brain that the P-61's brawn desperately needed. The British, under wartime pressure, were already fitting these sights into their own fighters, like the Spitfire and the Mosquito, with stunning success. But the real game changer was its transfer to the United States. Thanks to the Tizard Mission's legacy, the technology was shared. The Sperry Gyroscope Company in New York, a company that had built its reputation on naval gyroscopes for ship navigation, was tasked with mass-producing the sight for the USAF. They refined the design, made it more rugged, and adapted it for American aircraft. The version used in day fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, would become famous as the K-14. For the P-61, the system was even more integrated. The sight could be linked to both the fixed 20mm cannons and the .50 caliber dorsal turret. The pilot or the gunner could simply place the pipper on the enemy aircraft, squeeze the trigger, and the guns would pour a stream of concentrated fire into the precise point in space where the target was going to be. The effect was not just incremental, it was transformative. The Axis had scoffed at Allied night fighters because they were right. The problem was too hard for a human brain to solve. They just never imagined the Allies would build a new brain out of metal and glass and spinning rotors and put it right in the cockpit. The arrival of the Gyro Gunsight-equipped P-61s in the European theater of operations in 1944 was the beginning of the end for the Nachtjäger. The men of the 422nd and 425th Night Fighter Squadrons, based in England, finally had a complete weapon system. But it wasn't an easy transition. In fact, many pilots hated the new sight at first. They had spent their entire careers training to lead a target. Their instincts, honed by hours of gunnery practice, screamed at them to aim in front of the enemy. The new sight demanded the exact opposite. The manual said, "Put the pipper on the target and fire." To a veteran pilot, this felt completely wrong. It felt like they were aiming too far back, guaranteeing a miss. They had to unlearn a lifetime of muscle memory. They had to fly in the face of their own hard-won experience and put their faith in this strange, new magic box.
The engineers harnessed this tilt. They attached a mirror to the gyro's gimbal. A beam of light from a lamp inside the sight would bounce off this mirror and be projected onto the pilot's glass screen. This created the pipper, the dot of light the pilot used to aim. Now follow this, because this is the magic. When the pilot is flying straight, the gyro is stable and the pipper is in the center of the screen. When he banks to follow the WWII, his plane moves, but the gyro resists. This resistance tilts the mirror, and the mirror moves the pipper off-center. It moves it in the direction of the turn. How much does it move it? It moves it by the exact amount of lead the pilot needs. The faster the pilot turns to track the target, the more the gyro processes, the more the mirror tilts, and the further the pipper moves, automatically calculating the perfect deflection. The pilot no longer had to think. His only job was to keep the magical moving pipper on the target. The sight did the rest. It was, quite literally, an analog computer. It took the pilot's own turn rate as the primary input, combined it with the range, which the pilot, or RO, fed in, and solved the trigonometry problem instantly, displaying the answer as a single moving dot of light. This was the weapon the Allies had been waiting for. It was the brain that the P-61's brawn desperately needed. The British, under wartime pressure, were already fitting these sights into their own fighters, like the Spitfire and the Mosquito, with stunning success. But the real game-changer was its transfer to the United States. Thanks to the Tizard Mission's legacy, the technology was shared. The Sperry Gyroscope Company in New York, a company that had built its reputation on naval gyroscopes for ship navigation, was tasked with mass-producing the sight for the USAF. They refined the design, made it more rugged, and adapted it for American aircraft. The version used in day fighters like the P-51 Mustang would become famous as the K-14. For the P-61, the system was even more integrated. The sight could be linked to both the fixed 20mm cannons and the .50 caliber dorsal turret. The pilot or the gunner could simply place the pipper on the enemy aircraft, squeeze the trigger, and the guns would pour a stream of concentrated fire into the precise point in space where the target was going to be. The effect was not just incremental, it was transformative. The Axis had scoffed at Allied night fighters because they were right. The problem was too hard for a human brain to solve. They just never imagined the Allies would build a new brain out of metal and glass and spinning rotors and put it right in the cockpit.
The arrival of the Gyro Gunsight-equipped P-61s in the European theater of operations in 1944 was the beginning of the end for the Nachtjäger. The men of the 422nd and 425th Night Fighter Squadrons, based in England, finally had a complete weapon system. But it wasn't an easy transition. In fact, many pilots hated the new sight at first. They had spent their entire careers training to lead a target. Their instincts, honed by hours of gunnery practice, screamed at them to aim in front of the enemy. The new sight demanded the exact opposite. The manual said, "Put the pipper on the target and fire." To a veteran pilot, this felt completely wrong. It felt like they were aiming too far back, guaranteeing a miss. They had to unlearn a lifetime of muscle memory. They had to fly in the face of their own hard-won experience and put their faith in this strange, new magic box. The training was intense, but the first combat reports that came back were astonishing. Pilots who learned to trust the sight were achieving killed-around ratios that were previously unthinkable. They weren't firing 10,000 rounds for one kill. They were firing 1 or 2 short bursts and watching the target disintegrate. Lieutenant Colonel O.H. Ol Havdi, a commander of a Black Widow squadron, described the change. He said that with the old sight, a 60-degree deflection shot was a 1 in a million chance. With the new gyro sight, it was almost a guaranteed kill. The Ju-88 crews were baffled. They were being attacked from angles that made no sense. A P-61 would slide in, not from the 6 o'clock low position they were trained to defend against, but from the side, from a high-angle quartering attack. The Ju-88 pilot would bank and turn, the standard defensive maneuver that had saved him 100 times before. But the P-61 would turn with him, and a moment later, his wing would explode. The P-61 wasn't guessing. He was just keeping the pipper on the Ju-88's fuselage. The gyro was doing all the work. The Black Widow, now armed with its new brain, was finally able to use its devastating firepower. It was shredding the German night fighter force, one Ju-88 at a time. The Germans had no answer. Their technological arrogance had led them down a different path. They had invested in better radar, better engines, and stranger weapons like Schreg-Machiasen. They had focused on making their pilots better. The Allies had focused on making the problem simpler. And in the complex high-speed geometry of night combat, the simpler problem won. The scoffing in the Luftwaffe High Command turned to confusion and then to desperation. Their night hunters were now the hunted. The impact of the P-61, armed with its Gyro Gunsight, was not confined to the skies over Germany. In fact, the Black Widow would see some of its most decisive victories half a world away in the vast dark expanses of the Pacific theater. In Europe, the P-61 had arrived late in the war. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, crippled by fuel shortages and the relentless American daylight bombing campaign. But in the Pacific, the war was different. The Japanese, while not possessing a night fighter force as sophisticated as the Germans, were still a potent threat. They launched harassing night raids against American bases on Saipan, Guam, and Iwo Jima. Aircraft like the Kawasaki K-45, codenamed Nick by the Allies, were fast, twin-engine fighters that proved difficult to intercept. The P-61 squadrons deployed to the Pacific faced a unique set of challenges. They were flying immensely long missions over open ocean, navigating by primitive radio beacons. The enemy was elusive, but when they found him, the Gyro Gunsight gave them an almost supernatural advantage.
The Japanese pilots, like their German counterparts, had been trained to expect attacks from the rear. They were masters of the defensive climbing turn, a maneuver designed to force a pursuing fighter to overshoot. But this maneuver was useless against the P-61. The American pilot would simply pull his nose up, matching the turn. The gyro would instantly calculate the new deflection. The pipper would glide smoothly onto the climbing Japanese fighter, and a burst of 20mm cannon fire would end the fight. One of the most famous Black Widows of the war was a P-61 named Lady in the Dark, flying with the 548th Night Fighter Squadron. Her crew, Pilot Major Lee Kendall and radar operator Lieutenant Russell Russ Bulduck, would become the squadron's top aces. On one incredible night over Iwo Jima, they were vectored onto a series of incoming Japanese bogies. In a running battle, Kendall and Bulduck found, tracked, and destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft, a mix of Nick fighters and Irving bombers. This feat would have been utterly impossible with the old ring and bead sight. It was a testament to the crew, the radar, and the revolutionary gun sight that linked them together. The P-61s in the Pacific effectively shut down the Japanese night bombing campaign. They established total air superiority, protecting the vital B-29 bases that were pounding the Japanese homeland. The Black Widow had, without question, become the master of the night. It's fascinating to look back, isn't it? The sheer brain power that went into this from so many different people, all focused on solving one deadly problem. The history of technology is filled with these moments. We'd love to know what you think in the comments below. Did you, or perhaps your father or grandfather, ever work with similar analog computers, maybe in the service or in industry after the war? These steam-powered computers, all gears and gyros, were the bridge to the digital world we live in today. Your insights and memories are an invaluable part of this community, and we read as many as we can. While the P-61 was the ultimate night predator, the Gyro Gunsight's legacy extended far beyond the darkness. Its most famous application, the one that truly broke the back of the Luftwaffe, was the K-14 sight installed in the P-51 Mustang. The K-14, based on the same RAE and Sperry designs, gave American daylight fighter pilots the same unfair advantage. Suddenly, young pilots with only a few hundred hours of flight time could make deflection shots that were previously the domain of seasoned aces. They could engage German fighters at longer ranges and from tighter angles. The German aces, men like Adolf Galland, were horrified.
They were facing American pilots who simply could not miss. They had spent years perfecting their craft, only to be defeated by a piece of technology. Galland would later write that the K-14 was a turning point, that it allowed the Americans to shred his experienced Jagdflieger pilots, from whom the Luftwaffe could never recover. The Gyro Gunsight was, in every sense of the word, a war winner. It was a perfect example of the Boffin War. The Axis scoffed because they believed in the inherent insurmountable difficulty of the problem. The Allies, driven by the pragmatic and collaborative spirit championed by men like Henry Tizard, simply built a machine to make the problem easy. When the war ended, the Gyro Gunsight was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Allied victory. It represented a leap in technology so profound that it bridged the gap between the simple sights of World War I and the radar-guided missile-firing systems of the Cold War. The P-61 Black Widow, that beautiful, dark shape against the moon, would be retired fairly quickly after the war. The jet age had arrived, and the era of the propeller-driven night fighter was over. But its legacy, and the legacy of the small box of spinning mirrors it carried, was secure. The story of the P-61 and the Gyro Gunsight is more than just a piece of military trivia. It's a lesson in humility and ingenuity. It teaches us that arrogance, the belief that a problem is unsolvable, is the most dangerous enemy of all. The Germans had brilliant engineers and brave pilots, but their leadership scoffed. They believed their own propaganda, their own myth of invincibility. The Allies, on the other hand, were desperate, practical, and, thanks to men like Tizard, collaborative. They admitted the problem was too hard for a man, so they built a new kind of man, an analog computer that could think in 3 dimensions, instantly and perfectly. The next time you see a photograph of a P-61 Black Widow, that beautiful dark shape against the moon, remember what made it truly deadly. It wasn't just the 4 cannons in its belly or the powerful radar in its nose. It was the legacy of Henry Tizard's mission and the genius of a spinning gyroscope, a small device that gifted its pilot the superhuman ability to see the future, if only by a fraction of a second. And in the dark, at 300 miles an hour, a fraction of a second was all it took to change the world. This history matters. It's the story of the men behind the men, the engineers and scientists who gave the pilots the tools they needed to win. If you agree, the best way you can help us keep these stories alive in all their detail is to share this video with a friend, a family member, or in a group that appreciates this kind of history. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again.